we're in chapter 9, the second half of chapter 9. So we keep in mind that Ezra at this point has arrived in Jerusalem, and we talked about last week that in the span of probably about 4 months, he has been in Jerusalem teaching the law, and as a consequence of that, he is now in a position where he is being informed that there is a major serious problem that is going on. And in Ezra chapter 9, what is the serious problem that he's now having to deal with? Yeah, he's having to deal with the intermarriage within the population, which we know is a key problem. It was warned about repeatedly in the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy, in the book of Leviticus and Numbers. It was a key problem, and now it's a present condition that he has to deal with. Again, when we talked about the genealogy of the descendants, we talked about how Phinehas was important in that, and a lot of that due to the simple fact that Ezra is going to serve a similar role as what Phinehas did, but this time in Ezra's own time. And so we're going to look at the latter half of chapter 9, which is going to focus basically on what Ezra's response is to being informed of this issue. And as we kind of left off last week, it's going to be Ezra praying to God about the situation. We know from verse 5 that Ezra fasted in response to this. He gave the physical signs of sorrow and grief, but of course he goes beyond that and is going to pray to God about the matter, where he's going to be very open about the situation and his role in it. So this we're going to call Ezra's prayer. It'll encompass the last half of chapter 9, verses 6 through 15. So what are the key points to keep in mind? These are going to be things that come out in Ezra's prayer. In my mind, one of the things that comes out in Ezra's prayer is the fact that at times, the toleration of sin can be just as problematic as the actual practice of that sin. We're going to see that by how Ezra relates himself to what has gone on that he's been informed about. So the toleration of sin sometimes is just as condemning as the actual practice of that sin. When it comes to wrongdoing, the solution to that problem is through confession. So we're going to see what Ezra's role is in that as it pertains to what he's not just going to do for himself, but what he's also going to do for the people, again, acting in a sense as a priest in that matter. And we're also going to be reminded, as Ezra will point out, that God has done a lot for us that we have not deserved. God has done much more for us than what we have deserved, what we have earned. And that will come out toward the end of Ezra's prayer as he's kind of keeping all of this in context. And certainly we'll see the application of that for us as well. So those are the three things to think about. These are three things that I think about as I go through this part of the book of Ezra in chapter 9. So we'll come back to these points as we go along. So we're going to break this second section down into two sections. The first is going to be what we're going to entitle Giving Thanks in Sorrow. And this is going to basically encompass the first half of the prayer that Ezra is going to make. So now let's read Ezra chapter 9, verses 6 through 9. So Ezra falls on his knees, and beginning in verse 6, it says in his prayer, "O my God, I am ashamed and blush to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens. From the days of our fathers to this day we have been in great guilt, and for our iniquities we, our kings and our priests, have been given into the hand of the kings of the land, to the sword, to captivity, to plundering, and to utter shame, as it is today. But now for a brief moment favor has been shown by the Lord our God to leave us a remnant and to give us a secure hold within this holy place, or within his holy place. that our God may brighten our eyes and grant us a little reviving in our slavery. For we are slaves, yet our God has not forsaken us in our slavery, but has extended to us his steadfast love before the kings of Persia, to grant us some reviving, to set up the house of our God, to repair its ruins, and to give us protection in Judea and Jerusalem. So again, giving thanks in sorrow. We want to first of all start with noticing that this is an embarrassing sorrow. When you go back to verse 6, how does Ezra describe his response to what he has been told? So, depending on your translations, I'm looking at the ESV, it has ashamed and blushed. If you look, I think the King James, it says ashamed and blush. Some may have the word embarrassed. Yeah, and this is the idea. Ezra has been informed by this, and from his perspective, he's embarrassed by what has happened, as we're going to elaborate on in a minute. But that's the thing that stands out to us first of all. Notice that in verse 6, who does he hold responsible for what has happened? Right. And that's the important thing to keep in mind. And this is something that Ezra is doing here, is he's associating himself with what has gone on. This is why it's then embarrassing for him, not because Ezra himself has actually engaged in this practice, but from Ezra's perspective, he sees himself as guilty because this has gone on while he's been in Jerusalem. In essence, he's been there for 4 months, and this has gone on. Now that he's notified about it, before God at least, he's embarrassed by what has happened. So this is kind of the same idea behind what Paul would tell the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians 5, verses 2 and 6. And if somebody would, read for us both of those verses.
You are puffed up and have not rather mourned that he who has done this deed might be taken away from among you. Your glorying is not good. Know ye not that a little leaven leavens the whole lump?
So keep in mind, we talked about a few weeks ago the concept of the idea of the leaven, the idea that, before the Feast of Unleavened Bread, people did whatever they could to find any leaven in the house and get it away, because they were afraid of the idea that any leaven in the house would corrupt the observance of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it's the same idea that Paul was saying here, is that, and you go back to verse 1, right? You've got a man that has taken his father's wife, and Paul's point was not just to write to this person who's engaged in this activity, but he's also writing to the church, basically saying, you should be embarrassed by this, right? In verse 2, he said, you are arrogant. In other words, they're proud. They're not mourning for it, right? Ezra here is mourning for what he's been told is going on underneath his watch. And what Paul told the church is, you ought to have the same mindset in this regard. You've tolerated this, and you don't really see yourself as guilty for having allowed this to go on. And as it was said in verse 6, right, your boasting is not good. Your glorying in this is not good. And as he would go on to say, in chapter 5, right, cleanse out the old leaven, deliver the one to Satan. In other words, purge yourself of this, right? Get rid of it. Even though you have not engaged in this practice to the church of Corinth, you still hold a responsibility for not removing this. It's the exact same thing that Ezra is going through. Ezra identifies himself with this serious issue because, keep in mind, he is basically, in a lot of ways, put in charge, right? Teaching the law and having the responsibilities as a priest in that regard. So he sees himself as guilty, and so as a response, he has a need to do something about it. And so the only thing that's now left to do is to simply confess, right? And that's exactly what he's doing here in verses 6 and 7. He's been notified of it, and his only thing to do is now to turn to God to confess what has happened. Again, that's the concept of verses 6 and 7. It comes on, obviously down. The specifics of it come on down in verses 10 through 15. But that's what he's doing now, is he is confessing that this is now a problem, right? Nobody has done this. And obviously in the Bible, confession is important. You go back to Leviticus chapter 5 and verse 5, that passage makes very clear you're not going to be able to offer any offerings for sacrifices until, first of all, you have admitted wrongdoing, is the point, right? So when sacrifices were offered for sin in the Old Testament, before that, there was a period of where people confessed their sins, right? Because that was a part of seeking God's forgiveness. In Daniel chapter 9 and verse 20, you actually see Daniel do the same thing. He prays to God, and as he prays to God, he's talking about, he mentions that he is there to confess his sins before God. Now, we also know that in the New Testament, confession is important, right? You think about Romans chapter 10 and verses 9 and 10, for with the heart man believeth, and with the mouth, what? Confession is made unto salvation. Because that's also a point that carries over to the New Testament, right? Forgiveness of sins does not come until, first of all, you confess what you've done. And that's what Ezra is trying to do here, right? He's admitting that this is the only thing now to do. It's to confess. So why then is confession important? What does confession do? First of all, it reverses the attempt to cover up wrongdoing. It reverses the attempt to cover up wrongdoing. You think about what Achan did, right, in Joshua chapter 7. He took the spoils of the city of Jericho, unlike what he was supposed to do. And instead of confessing what he had done at first, what did he do? He hid it, right? In other words, he made an attempt to cover it up. It's the literal idea of the word confession is to expose something that's covered up, right? So you think about Achan tried to hide it. What confession does, first of all, is it reverses the attempt to cover it up. Now, when it comes to Ezra's situation, the idea of covering up is the fact that people have allowed this to go on and have refused to acknowledge that this is indeed a problem. And so, first of all, what he has to do on behalf of the people is he's got to admit before God, we're not going to keep covering this up. Or in other words, we're not going to keep tolerating this existing without acknowledging that it does have serious repercussions for the population. What confession also does is it also recognizes the mercy of God. If somebody would read for us Psalm 32, verses 1 through 5. Because what confession also does, once we say we're going to stop covering up the wrongdoing, it also in part recognizes the mercy of God in the same process. So Psalm 32, verses 1 through 5.
Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man unto whom the Lord imputeth not iniquity, and to whose spirit there is no guile. When I kept silence, my bones waxed old from the roar all the day long. For day and night thy hand was heavy upon me, a moisture turned to the dry of the summer. I acknowledge my sin unto thee, and mine iniquity have I not hid. I said, I will confess my transgression unto the Lord, and thou forgavest the iniquity of my sin.
So you notice that in verses, in verses 1 and 2, again, the idea of blessed is happy, right? Happy is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and whose spirit there is no deceit, right? You get the idea of deceit, the idea of covering up. And in verses 3 and 4, right, David points out what are the consequences of covering it up, right? He gives the idea of the body wasting away, the idea of being without strength, the idea that covering this up gradually weighs down on the person before God. And all he says in verse 5 is simply, when I acknowledge my sin to you, I did not cover my iniquity, right? I did not cover it up. And so I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Why David confessed his sins to the Lord is because he knew that the Lord would be faithful to forgive him. That's also what Ezra is seeking out here in this period where he's going to give thanks and sorrow, because he's also going to recognize that God's mercy, like it was given to David in chapter 32, that same mercy can be given to God's people. And so that's, in essence, something to keep in mind. It goes back to that second point, right? God has done a lot for us, or goes back to that third point. God has done a lot for us, much more than we deserve. David did not deserve forgiveness, but he knew that God was faithful to give it to him. Ezra has the exact same mindset about what God can do for his people in chapter 9. And so that's what confession does. It recognizes the mercy of God. It also establishes the authority of God. Whenever we confess our wrongdoing, it establishes that we do answer to a higher power. And obviously, when we confess our sins, we're confessing our sins to the higher power, and that is obviously God. When you think about Acts chapter 5, verses 3 and 4, when you remember that that's the occasion of Ananias and Sapphira, right? And, they're called out in their wrongdoing. But when Peter confronted Ananias about the situation, what did Ananias, or what did Peter say about who Ananias was lying to? Yeah, right. You lie to man, or you're not lying to men, you're lying to God. He also mentions, right, they tried to deceive the Holy Spirit. And that's the point. Whenever we refuse to not confess our wrongdoing, we reject the authority of God, which is exactly what Ananias and Sapphira did. They refused to confess what they did, and thus that's why Peter's very adamant, you are lying to God, you're trying to deceive the Holy Spirit. And that's what confession does those three things. And Ezra recognizes that by doing those three things, it can actually help the people out, at least in terms of what he hopes from what we'll see later on. So notice that he talks about the extent of this sin. Again, verse 7, he connects what they've done, again, to all the things that their fathers had done. It's very common in the Old Testament to see that happen. Whenever you see a figure in the Old Testament talk about wrongdoing, it happens where they connect it based on what their ancestors had done. And that's the extent of what he's saying in verse 7. We're not all that different from them. Notice that he also says in verse 6 that we are drowning in it, right? He says our iniquities have risen higher than our heads. Our guilt has mounted up to the heavens. That literally carries the idea of somebody drowning. And that's what he's saying here. This is such a pervasive problem that it's not just a simple matter to deal with. Ezra's saying we're drowning in this situation. Again, also reinforces the idea that he knows that only God can fix this situation, right? Because if you're drowning, the idea is you have no way of actually taking care of the problem. So we are drowning in it. He also then states, we now face extinction like our ancestors. Again, in verse 7, when he talks about those ancestors, he talks about the fact that they were given to the kings of the land, to the sword, to captivity, to plundering, and to utter shame. In other words, we now face distinction just as our ancestors did. We're not going to read this passage, but in Psalm 78, 32 through 37, that passage goes back to a psalm where the writer of the psalm is doing that very thing. He's connecting the present sinful situation to what had been done by his ancestors in the past. It's very common in the Old Testament to see it. And so that's the extent of it, right? We're drowning in it. We know what it leads to. But at the same time, we do have a reason to be thankful. And that is verses 8 and 9, because Ezra is reminded of the fact of God's favor on his people. And this is just a reference to allowing them to return to the promised land. Now, in verse 8, when he talks about thanksgiving here, what he's talking about is, you see that phrase, to give us a secure hold. If you've got another translation in verse 8, after it says to leave us a remnant to escape, what do other translations have here for what comes after that? So to give us a peg, if you've got the King James, it has the word nailed in his holy place. And so what he's saying here is that the thanks that he's given for is the idea that God has reestablished a tent in Jerusalem. And so what Ezra is saying here is, do not take away the stake to the tent, right? And that the bottom right picture are older archaeological artifacts of tent pegs or tent stakes. But what was the purpose of a tent stake? Keep it in place, right? And that's what Ezra's saying here. You know, if you think about Israel as a tent, that tent had been uprooted, moved to Persia. And what Ezra is saying is that God, through his grace, his favor, has put the tent back in Jerusalem, but he recognizes that God could easily, once again, uproot that tent and put it into captivity once again. And so Ezra is saying here, right, you've given us a secure hold within his holy place. And so, in other words, we don't want the stake to the tent to be removed. We don't want to be in a position where we are taken back into captivity, right? We've been brought back from it thanks to your help. And as long as that tent stake is there, metaphorically, we're always going to remain here, right? And that's due to God's help. He then also reiterates the idea, right, that we keep it in place, our protection. We see in verse 9 that he talks about he uses the metaphor that the people of God are slaves. And what he's talking about here is the extent that they're still under the authority of the Persian Empire. They don't have complete autonomy. But notice that he said, right, to set up the house of God, to repair its ruins, and to give us protection in Judea and Jerusalem. Now, from what I understand, I don't believe the wall of the city has been fully rebuilt at this point. That happens a little bit later in Nehemiah. But simply what he's referring to here is, God's hedge of protection that he often had for his people, right? The promise is made back to the time of Joshua that even though they were smaller than some of the other nations around them, God would help deliver them in battle is the idea here. And so, God has done all of this for us. We didn't deserve it. And yet here we are allowing this to go on. And as a consequence, we are simply rejecting what God has done for us. And we need to be ashamed of that, which is exactly what Ezra is saying in this prayer. And so this is the idea of giving thanks in sorrow. And so then verses 10 through 15 talk about why we stand in judgment. So in verse 10, Ezra continues on in this prayer. And now, O our God, what shall we say after this? For we have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded by your servants, the prophets, saying, the land that you are entering to take possession of it is a land impure, with the impurity of the peoples of the land, with their abominations that have filled it from end to end, with their uncleanliness. Therefore, do not give your daughters to their sons, neither take their daughters for your sons, and never seek their peace or prosperity, that you may be strong and eat the good of the land, and leave it for an inheritance to your children forever. And after all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and for our great guilt, seeing that you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquities deserve, and have given us such a remnant as this, shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with the people who practice these abominations? Would you not be angry with us until you consumed us, so that there should be no remnant, nor any to escape? O Lord, the God of Israel, you are just, for we are left a remnant that has escaped, as it is today. Behold, we are before you in our guilt, for none can stand before you because of this. All right, so why do we stand in judgment? Notice that, first of all, Ezra says that Jerusalem has become a polluted land. In verse 11, as he's talking about having forsaken the commandments, you see that he uses the word impurity, right? He talks about before they were there, that this was a land that was impure, with the impurity of the peoples of the lands. And what he's talking about now is that same impurity is what accurately describes what Jerusalem and the surrounding area have become. That word impurity comes from the idea, literally comes from the idea of a woman going through menstruation, right? And you go back to the Old Testament law, when a woman was going through menstruation, this actually made her unclean. And that's the idea that Ezra is getting at here. In Lamentations 1 and verse 17, Jeremiah uses the exact same idea, comparing Jerusalem to a woman in menstruation, basically, in the literal sense, making that comparison to say that the city has now become unclean. And if you think back to the Old Testament law, right, could people come before the presence of God being ritually unclean? No, right? We'll talk more about that in our sermon this morning. And that's what Ezra's saying here. When he's talking about the fact that we have become an impure land, just like in the law of Moses, where one could not present themselves before God in a state of impurity or in a state of uncleanliness, Ezra's saying now that the people of God should not have access to the presence of God, should not have access to being able to intercede for God because they are impure, in the same way that the Canaanite nations had been prior to the Israelites taking over the land, is the idea. They are now a polluted land. And so we have then neglected what you have done for us. And so we then should deserve a lot worse than what we have. Again, verse 12, he goes back to the issue that was at stake when the Israelites first entered into the land of Canaan. That's the same predicament here. And so in verse 13, notice again that he says, after all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and for our great guilt, seeing that you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquities deserved, and have given us such a remnant as this. Whereas in prior times, when the people engaged in this immorality, and when they had the concept of if the temple's there, God's presence is there, basically they took for granted the idea that God would not punish them. What Ezra is simply saying here is that when we take into consideration what you have done for us, and now what we have done in response, not only do we deserve to be punished, but we deserve a whole lot worse than what you have given us. We deserve a whole lot worse rather than the situation that we're in. And, sometimes as Christians, that may be something that we have to keep in mind at times when we do feel like we get frustrated with God, right? Because, at some point in your life as a Christian, you're going to feel we all feel the temptation at times to be frustrated that God doesn't do enough for us. And Ezra here is trying to keep in mind for his sake, probably the people's sake, and for us, the reader's sake. When we think about what God has done for us and what we often do in retaliation for that, God could do a whole lot worse to us than what he has actually done. God could punish us a whole lot worse than what he has done, right? We read about in the Old Testament sometimes people being killed directly by God for their sins. We don't have that happen today. God intervening in that way. And so Ezra's saying, we have not fully appreciated your mercy because we deserve worse. And so as Christians, that's something for us to keep in mind as well, that, we get frustrated with God. We have to keep in mind that God has been very merciful to us, much more than we deserve. And so then we simply have no justification behind what we have done. Right, as he says in verse 14, he asks, kind of hypothetical questions here. Shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with the peoples who practice these abominations? Right, and the obvious answer is no. Would you not be angry with us until you consumed us, so that there should be no remnant, nor any to escape? Well, the answer to that second question is also obvious. Yes, God's going to be angry, because just as it was a sin in earlier times in Israel's history, so it was, a sin here. And so then verse 15, notice, we are left a remnant that has escaped as it is today. Behold, we are before you in our guilt, for none can stand before you because of this. And so here he's using the idea of a judicial setting, right? The idea that we are standing before a judge, we are being the determination is being made about whether we are innocent or guilty of a crime. And what Ezra is saying here is there is no question about innocence or guilt. It is absolutely 100% fact that we are now guilty, for what we have done. When I think about this concept of the idea of standing before God, I think about the book of Job. I think about the attempts in the book of Job that when he was dealing with the condemnation of his friends, Job pleaded before God and simply said, let me stand before your presence and plead my case, right? He wanted to stand before God to prove his innocence. And what happens at the end of the book when Job does stand before the presence of God and basically is demanding God to answer his questions?
You, Job, question me, really.
Right.
Can you do this? Can you do that? That I have done.
Right. Job wants to stand before God. Job feels like he's been slighted by God. God appears to Job on multiple occasions at the end of the book and basically lays out what Brother Wayne said, right? Can you answer these questions for me, Job? And Job, of course, couldn't. But the point is that Job could not stand before God because of this. And so that's what Ezra is saying here. This is not a question of in a legal setting. This is not a question of maybe we're innocent, maybe we're guilty, maybe we have an argument for our innocence. He's simply saying there is no argument. There is no way we can defend what we've done, which is why then he is in a position where he is confessing what has happened by confessing that they have not kept the earlier requirement that the people first had to enter in when they entered the land of Canaan. In chapter 10, we're going to see the response of the people. But that's the idea. We could not stand before God. And so we now, in essence, Ezra is saying, we're going to have to do the right thing, fix the problem, but also throw ourselves at the mercy of God to intervene and forgive us of this situation. With that being said, are there any comments on what we said in chapter 9?
Paul speaks of godly sorrow in 2 Corinthians, I think, chapter 5, and certainly Ezra in chapter 9 epitomizes what genuine godly sorrow is about. He's not just sorry or sad they've done wrong. He knows how very serious this is, and like to see just his bodily posture, falling down and spreading his hands toward heaven and feeling ashamed and guilty, which is something, of course, the feeling that we should have
Right. Absolutely. And it's going to be that example that Ezra sets here that we're going to see in chapter 10 that part of the people of Israel are going to respond to this visual image that Ezra has presented about responding to this situation. And that's where we'll pick up next week in chapter 10. And chapter 10, of course, will wrap us up with the book of Ezra. But thank you for your time and your attention this morning.